You're listening to Centered. This week, two special guests. Former Minnesota Senate Minority Leader Melissa Lopez Franzen joins us to share her perspective on the domestic terrorism that shook our entire nation and cost the lives of Minnesota Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman and her husband, while leaving Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife in critical condition. We'll also be joined by violinist Charlie C.M., whose tour off his latest album brings him back to the world stage and whose music will be featured as part of this podcast. And we'll talk about the conflict in the Middle East as President Trump weighs his options with Iran. I'm Louis Miranda alongside Jeremy Murphy and Carl Meacham. Melissa, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us during what's a difficult moment for the country, but a particularly painful and tragic moment for those of you close to the victims and to this horrific plot. If there's one thing we can learn and that we have to remind the public, it's that public servants are people. They're human beings. Getting to know them for who they really are is so important to help diffuse the polarization that's taken hold in politics. Please tell us about Minnesota Speaker Melissa Hortman and State Senator John Hoffman for who they truly are.
Well, thank you, Luis, for having me. These are friends, colleagues, and it's our political family. And anybody who's been in a campaign, anybody who's served in office, you all know it's not just the candidate, it's everybody behind them. So obviously this has touched so many aspects of our fabric here in Minnesota. I knew Melissa Hortman as a friend, a leader. I saw her the night before and saw her husband. We've traveled together with my husband. We've done more than just socializing and campaigning together. A person who, sat right next to me when we were negotiating. I was leader of the Senate, minority leader, and she was speaker. So I got to witness her in action. And I will tell you that she, nothing went by her. She was a steadfast leader. She found compromise. She knew her caucus and her people. And as you know, in politics, it's pretty, we have a big tent, if you will, in a Democratic Party. And she was able to bring all those voices to the negotiating table and get things done for Minnesota. The last thing that we talked about on Friday, the DFL event that we had, a Humphrey Mondale dinner, where we basically celebrate accomplishments for the Democrats. And, everyone from Senator Klobuchar, the Governor Wallace was there. I got a chance to talk to Melissa and Mark, and we'll talk about Senator Hoffman and his wife, Yvette, who I also had the chance to say hi to that night. And I remember just telling her how gracious she was for letting her title passing her title on, if you will, because Minnesota has a 50-50 split in the House chamber right now. We're the divided chamber in the country. And in order to move forward, she gave up her title as speaker and she became Speaker Emeritus. I said, how gracious you were to do that and compromise and get this done. And on Monday, they had just finished a special session, which she also was able to get through and shepherd through, being the deciding vote in a big package that she called it her toughest vote in her career. And she just, kind of dismissed it, just like, I had that offer in the beginning and they didn't want it. And, eventually they took the offer. So she was always 2 steps ahead of everybody. We talked about politics, and then her staffer from the Democratic finance campaign side was like ready to go to start campaigning for the next election. And I remember telling Mark Hortman, just like, she's not going to take a break. Everyone can take a little break after session and after the special, but she just keeps going. And Mark Warren was there, who is, and I mentioned these names because staff is just like family. Staff is right there in lockstep with the leader. We can't do this alone. And he took her away to take a picture because they had not taken a picture in a while. And I just remember sending a message to Mark Warren, who again reports to Hortman in terms of the campaign side. He's the one who helps fundraise with her every step of the way. And they took a picture and she was looking for a good light for that picture. And I just said to him in a message, just like, I'm so glad you took that picture. But these are normal people. These are everyday people who do this to fund our government, to make sure the schools have the resources they need, that you have your health care if you rely on state support. And they're regular people who are doing this for public service. And I think we lose track of that. We're all giving something up to do this work that's not for fame or glory or money. It's because we believe in the public good.
And that's such an important point because most state legislators have day jobs. They're doing something else. They're teachers. They're And many state legislatures meet for very brief periods. I know in Florida, where I'm from, the state legislature meets basically every 2 years. And in the meantime, folks are, everybody's neighbors, and they're doing whatever job it is that's part of the community. And I think we need to remind people of that, because we do need to lower the temperature. And on both sides. Look, I'm not trying to blame one side or the other on this. I think we've seen incidents of political violence affect both sides. And we need to take this moment to really lower the temperature. Talk to us also about John.
So Senator Hoffman and I got elected at the same time in 2012, and his race was the second. My race was the most expensive. His was the second most expensive. So we always kind of joked around how we, at that point, we also had a trifecta, and we flipped the Senate. So we just became close friends, and we're moderate Democrats. So we, naturally worked together on many issues. He called me Mija all the time, although he called Mija a lot of people. He just just a regular guy who worked really, really hard to bring voices of the vulnerable populations in healthcare. He worked really hard on the Health and Human Services Committee, which is where I spend a lot of my time as well. I saw him on Friday. His wife, Yvette, gave her a hug. I told him, let's grab lunch, dinner, or anything in your district soon. And he's like, me? Just, he's just a regular guy as well, who doesn't need to be doing this work. He worked in the federal level too on DHS matters. So he's very passionate about his work and making sure people, especially the elderly and disabled populations and the vulnerable, have a voice, because he knows all the statutes at the federal level. He would just throw them at you. And I'm like, okay, John, you're the expert, not me. So I was shocked, and he's a moderate. So when I heard the news, and just hearing that he was one of the people targeted, and obviously his wife Yvette was there, and Hope, his daughter, I know them really well. And why them? Why the moderate Democrats, who are what we need more of, moderate people who are willing to work with the other side. We need more of people who are willing to work with the other side, not just send tweets back and forth, or, willing to sit down and listen. And then Melissa, why the best that we have, right? Who got the deal done for Minnesotans and for our state. It's tragic. It's unconscionable. Last night we were at a vigil at the Capitol. It was really somber. The family was there. It was the first time we all got together to pay tribute to the leader that she was and will always be remembered as. And we're talking about having her lie in state at the Capitol, which will be the first woman ever since the Capitol building was built in 1905. So that is who she means, what she means to our state.
That's amazing. I also want to talk about the broader picture of safety and security in the political context. For years, the Department of Homeland Security, they have an annual threat assessment report. And part of what that report has included for many years is this idea that lone offenders and small groups pose the greatest threat of carrying out attacks with little to no warning. The most recent report was published in October, and it highlighted that people motivated by various ideologies or grievances, conspiracy theories, and other factors that are frankly aggravated in the current political environment do represent the biggest threat. But we also know that there's a history there of politicization that sometimes limits that. There was an investigative report from investigative journalist Jana Winter in 2021 that laid out that there was an analyst who had tried to warn about the attack on the U.S. Capitol in December of 2020. And those warnings went unheeded. DHS produced no warnings, no bulletins, no alerts during the first Trump administration. And of course, 4 years later, President Trump pardoned 1,500 individuals who participated in that attack. And so, thinking about that politicization and that Congress is now working quickly to try to step up security for members of Congress, what are state legislators thinking in terms of the collaboration with the federal government and how we can try to make sense of this moment in a way that makes sure that these institutions are doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, that's a great question. And I know, as a matter of fact, the Campaign Finance Board in Minnesota decided to purge addresses of elected officials. That was something that was done proactively after the incident. I guess not proactively, but we didn't need legislation to do that, is what I mean. We've had this discussion before years ago of doing just that. It's so easy to find information. And, I remember when the incident happened this weekend, all of us who are either current elected or former elected or someone who is perhaps visible in the community, we had a squad car across, in our street just to make sure that we felt safe. And I know many of our colleagues do. I know for a fact some people are thinking of selling their homes and moving. So it's shaking the fabric of your home and your safety. But purging address isn't going to fix everything, right? How do we take tips and how do we take, threats more seriously? And we don't have all the resources in the world, but we can do a better job, especially in light of what happened here, because it was a concerted effort and there was a sort of a manifesto list. How do we make sure that all of us are safe in our communities, irrespective whether you're elected or not? We're all trying to, whether you work for government, I think there needs to be, to your point earlier, you got to tone it down. And there's only so much you can do by regulation and legislation. But certainly we need to do that. I've talked to folks who want to have further restrictions on bump stocks and other, weapons restrictions. There's a right to have, bear arms, but then, we know Hoffman and Yvette, his wife, were shot 8 and 9 times. Do we want those weapons in the street that are able to make that harm and they're miraculously alive? I think we can do more. We have to connect more. We talk about federal resources. This was the largest manhunt in Minnesota history, and there was coordination between local, state, and federal, and that is supposed to work. So I hope we have a debrief or a look back on how that worked. We couldn't have done it without that in 40 hours to capture the suspect and now bring him to justice. So I'm all for what we can do, but I think it's also toning the rhetoric down at the very top in terms of our leadership.
Melissa, I have a question. Do you think the pardons of the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, do you think that sent a message that this is okay? That, Trump is there, he's got your back? I mean, these people were violent and now they're pardoned. Like, what do you think this says?
I do think it sends a message that, there's a law, but some of them can, basically be above the law. There's in Minnesota, we also had a recent, people go and are not happy with their local electeds. In this case, a board of regents of the University of Minnesota, the regents who voted for a certain aspect of the budget or a transaction, their homes were vandalized just this week. And if you don't hold people accountable, even at that level, you are sending the wrong message. I remember vividly, I was in the Minnesota Senate when January 6th happened, and we tried to pass a resolution to condemn the January 6th attacks. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle blocked it. So that is, we cannot afford to do that moving forward. And I know that our Minnesota federal delegation sent a united statement this weekend on the attacks on Melissa Hortman, her husband, and Yvette and Hoffman. And that needs to happen more often than not. We have to tone it down. It takes all of us. But again, it starts at the top, and we cannot pardon people who have committed crimes. That happens in court. That happens in the judicial system. Respect the division of our powers in government and let people defend themselves in court.
Yeah, and it's so important to highlight that this can affect both sides. That we saw a Republican congressional softball game get shot up just a few years ago by an extremist on the other side. And so this should not be a partisan issue. If the American democracy is to survive, we have to denounce political violence.
Yeah, but
Carl, I'm sorry, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, no. I in the same line. I mean, the environment that's being created, though, and I think was alluded. January 6th protesters, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, they've received pardons. And one of the things that is of most concern is, what message does it send when bridge builders are gunned down in their homes? I mean, these, as you mentioned, these weren't firebrands or partisans. They were moderates. And even moderate public servants are targets really shows that something is broken. And this wasn't about policy. It was just about rage and radicalization. And, extremism doesn't really distinguish between left and right, as you were mentioning, Luis. Nobody's really safe in these situations. And I just don't see that there are efforts to tone it down. And unfortunately, violence is becoming a political tool. And they're dehumanizing folks that they disagree with. And it's tolerated if no one speaks up. And, if this situation is sort of the beginning of more situations like that, I think that we really have a problem in this country. But someone really has to speak out and change the tone of what's going on.
Yeah, we had bipartisan presence yesterday at the vigil, I will say. And I wish we had more of that happening across our country. But I did speak to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and they were there and just in disbelief. And I'm thankful that they showed up to be there with us in Mourning, because this was a resident of our state. This was our colleague. This was our friend, and politics have been put aside. I always joke, you hear in the news our disagreements, but the majority of the time we're having regular discussions about family and kids. We're not having enough of them, but we are certainly closer than people think. And just yesterday, seeing all the staff and people who work at the Capitol who are nonpartisan, people who didn't know the Hortmans, who were just there because a public servant was no longer with us, that was working for them. We just need more community today, and every day. Just talk to your neighbors. You can skip the politics, but just remember to talk to your neighbors and ask them if they need a hand and how they're doing, because it's shaken all of us. I will say, not just politicians. It's shaken every community. We were on lockdown in many parts of our state as they were on the manhunt. And that affects all of us. And we just need to remind ourselves that our neighbors are needing to be checked on, and everyone's processing this a little differently.
Let me ask
I can imagine
question.
those hours during the manhunt, that what folks were going through, who had to wonder, where is this person? What are they thinking? I know we were concerned for you and for the safety of other friends in Minnesota. Nobody should have to go through this.
There's a question that comes up, though, Melissa, that you never know when is the right time to ask these questions, because it's sensitive and it's raw, right? And, Republicans always come back with sort of a, when something like this happens, we'll pray for people. What did the prayers do? This happens over and over again. Here, Melissa, I think you're highlighting the need to build community. And I think that's super important, right? So people understand, that, these are, even though you might disagree with people politically, these are people just like you and me, right? They have children, they have interests, they have fears and desires and whatever in their life. My whole question, though, is what can be done in a concrete way to avoid that someone, again, with that kind of radicalized viewpoint has access to a weapon. I know that these are hard issues, and you don't want to take advantage or be viewed as taking advantage of a tragedy to push these things, but there have to be. This cannot continue. I mean, you don't want to limit people's ability to express themselves verbally. I think that's the wrong way, but you do want to make it harder for people to resort to a weapon, to cancel out, to snuff out someone they disagree with. How do you see that conversation playing out in Minnesota? How do you see for the party? Because the party is also dealing with this issue as you go into the midterms, as you go into a presidential cycle. How do you see dealing with these difficult issues?
That's a very complex question, right? And I think there's many dimensions to it. Talking to some, Democratic operatives, we're like trying to figure out, why was it a target on Democrats, right, in Minnesota? And we can unpack that. Minnesota has a trifecta at the moment, or had it, and now it's 50-50. But we've had power in one side of the aisle for the last few years. Mm-hmm. And what you do with power, you get things done. But that's the will of the people. People voted for that. Mm-hmm. And we have to remind people that that's what we voted them to do. And if you want to change that, then you have an election coming up to do so. You don't go and eliminate the leaders at your will through violence. And there have been peaceful protests, as you all have seen across the country. That's what democracy looks like, having peaceful discourse. And the moment you cross the line, which obviously it has been, how do you put the genie back in the bottle? How do you condemn violence? So I think all of our leaders, and when I've been talking to some folks around, what I say is like, we can't normalize this. So we have to speak out against it, whether it's targeted at the president or targeted at a congressman or targeted at a school board member. We've had school board members threatened during the pandemic. We forget that. They are elected there to serve our kids. We need to be the adults in the room, and it starts at the top. In terms of what we can do in a formalized setting, I thought Minnesota was in a pretty decent state. And I say that because the Humphrey School of Public Policy, what we have in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, convenes us all together at the beginning of session. We've done that every single year to have those discourse in the beginning of session. We have a few other tools that are getting members. We have an organization called Citizens League, which is now also putting folks from a Democratic district in a Republican district and vice versa, and starting those more formal programs to live in the life in terms of understanding what a rural Democrat means, or a rural member means versus a urban, suburban, and so forth. So I thought we were making progress. I would never imagine that this was going to happen to one of ours in our state, because Minnesota is pretty progressive, and we are a place that we take care of each other. Of course, we went through the civil unrest and the reckoning of the murder of George Floyd. That was another place where I thought we came together to pass comprehensive public safety reform, and we did that at a bipartisan level. Back then, just 5 years ago. So I thought we were on our course, but as people say, and we've heard this, you have democracy if you can keep it. We can't let down. We have to continue to make progress and have the conversations and continue to educate people. I've talked to people who never thought the government was so involved in your lives, but yes, the post office could close. Or yes, your Medicaid might be interrupted. And now they're paying attention, and it's our job, all of our jobs, to educate people, not to patronize them, not to, go to rural communities and say, I know better, but just to have discussions. This is how it works. Do you want to get involved and have respect for our leaders at every level, schools and beyond?
And I'm so glad that you touched on that, the George Floyd protests in particular, because Minnesota has a history there that's still raw. I think you guys took good steps to sort of come together. But how are you looking at these protests that are happening all around the country right now? You when you were running for higher office, one of the things you talked about was your mom being an educator. Your dad was a police officer. So you're someone who understands that you can both care about the police officer, but also care that they have good health care, and also care that the person in their custody or the person that they're interacting with is treated fairly and within the structure of the law. The tensions right now between federal law enforcement and the public all over the country, it's going to take years to repair that damage. What do you think about that, and particularly in the context of what you've seen unfold over the last few years after the George Floyd protests?
Thanks for that question. We recently had a unannounced ICE, some sort of activity in Minneapolis, which is an area where it's pretty sensitive, and in terms of the police and civilian interaction after George Floyd's murder. And it was a lot of confusion So people want to know how are you interacting, when and how. I think there's a lot of distrust right now because of what's happening at the federal level with immigration. I think that's an issue that's being obviously politicized. Probably all of us have worked on that issue in one way, shape, or form, because it impacts every aspect of our lives, whether you want to recognize it or not. But people have fear, and it's not great to operate in fear. And when we're trying to repair relationships with public safety officials, and then you have the federal public safety officials coming and doing something completely opposite and unannounced, it's pretty chaotic. And what we're seeing is that communities coming together and trying to be a voice for those who can't be heard because they're in fear, they're hiding. We're breaking apart families when people get deported, without due process. That is not the nation we want. And I want to reiterate the due process piece. People don't realize how important and foundational that is for our society. And we're chipping away at it. And irrespective if you're an immigrant or, a citizen, all of us are entitled to due process. Our president was entitled to due process when he was alleged to commit certain crimes, and he had his day in court. We want the same opportunity for every one of us who is stepping in this country, because that is what this country is about. And we cannot let people just dismiss that and go on with the next issue that's going to be distracting us from the core foundations of our democracy. And I feel really strongly about that, obviously. And we need, again, to be loud about it and ensure people understand what that means to everyday Americans and everyday person who resides in our state.
Melissa, you mentioned something that's super important there. A lot of us here in DC see what's happening here in a direct way, and people are outraged, right? You have friends that have lost their jobs because of DOGE cuts and USAID. You have this sort of running over of people's rights, as you mentioned, the ignorance with regards to due process and its application. You have the president running amok over the powers of the legislative branch. And we kind of think that it's something that everybody knows. And then we start looking outside of DC, and we run into a different set of views. I would love it now, particularly if you could sort of explain a little bit, how are you seeing it? You're in Minnesota. Minnesota was one of those swing states. How are you seeing this sort of in your everyday life? It's very difficult to explain to people the virtues of democracy until they lose them.
Yeah.
It's not like you can run on democracy, unfortunately. But when you lose it, you know that you lost it. So how are you connecting with people regarding some of these problems that we all see, but I think that Americans don't feel yet, and particularly outside of the DC or New York City or LA, Chicago world? How are you seeing this? How are you talking about this with your constituents?
Yeah. Well, let me first clarify. Donald Trump won more points in Minnesota, is getting narrow, but he did not win the state in this last election. We were the only state that kept blue. But we did see some contraction, and the Democrats did lose ground to him, especially in rural Minnesota. So when I recently announced to run for U.S. Senate and was doing my 87 county tour around the state, I heard, to your point, people who weren't affected necessarily, or who were just talking to folks, oh, it's going to affect you because you work for the federal, whatever department in a different part of the state. I remember vividly going to International Falls, Minnesota. It's on the border with Canada. We have a border in Minnesota with Canada. And obviously we knew that Canadians are not very happy with the Americans right now. And this was before the tariffs were in place. And I was doing a tour up there and talking to local residents. One of them, who was a former mayor of International Falls, owned a coffee shop and a flower shop 6 blocks away from Canada. He said, I just lost 30% of my customers. They're not coming to Minnesota. Wow. So in a town that relies on that commerce and that ability to go back and forth, basically the border was closed before it factually was. And the tariffs weren't in place. So he was already talking about how hard it was to keep his shop open when he's bringing in beans from Latin America, flowers from Latin America, and what that could mean for his livelihood. He was literally in tears. And then I also was talking to other folks around the state where they were like, you don't feel the cuts of Medicaid just yet, but eventually it trickles down. It takes longer to get there. I think in the urban core, usually, it's obviously more people and potentially more people interacting with the government. But folks do feel it when they're spending more on their the products that they need for farming, right? So if they need fertilizer from Canada, what's going to cost you more? So we have been seeing that, and it's literally trickling around. But what I did find interesting this was 3 or 4 months ago, people were showing up early on. People were not going to take it. All these protests that we see, we had the No Kings protest this weekend. We have other, whatever they want to call them, but it's really just people using their voice because they're being either cut all over the country and all over the state and their jobs at every level, whether they work for the Department of Ag or they work with, for revenue, whatnot. We are seeing some of those cuts at the local level, and it just takes a little longer. But the point is that I saw a lot of thirst for information, a lot of thirst for convening, and we have to use this moment, not for a Democratic or Republican moment, for an American moment, right? We need to use this moment to engage people in a more productive and positive way, because our perception of us around the country and around the world, more than the country, is changing. People are not seeing America the same way if you travel for work, and we're losing ground there. And it's going to take all of us, not the president, not Congress, to really change that narrative by being more engaged in our democracy.
Yeah, the images being broadcast all over the world and on social media are definitely doing incredible damage to our reputation. But Melissa, I promised you 30 minutes, so thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, on such a difficult time, we're praying for you, for Senator Hoffman and his wife, for Speaker Horstman's family. We're really grateful for your insights, and you're someone who I know you're no longer running, but we need you in the conversation. I hope to see you stay involved and hopefully run again. And like you said, when we were talking, even before we started recording, like, we can't live in fear. We can't let moments like these define us. And it should only strengthen our resolve to speak out against violence and against polarization, which is what we hope to do here at Centered. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you.
I do too. And I guess one last word I would say, action for folks to consider. If you're comfortable sending an email with your thoughts to your neighbor, your elected official, or someone, just because it's good to check in, but also it's part of our humanity. We used to call people more. Now we text. Whatever you want to do, just reach out to someone and say you're thinking of them. You don't have to go above that. We're living through a really tough time in our country. And again, we can't let this be normalized. And the only way we do that is for people to not turn a blind eye that this happened, but that we're going to change the course.
Yeah,
indeed. Thank you, Melissa.
You.
Carl, I also wanted to touch on Iran and the situation unfolding right now with Israel and Iran and the Trump administration sending mixed messages about its level of involvement, but also in the midst of President Trump considering stepping up the American involvement to include potentially bombing a nuclear site in Iran. Bring us up to speed on that one, Carl.
I'm watching this with deep concern. I think Trump seems increasingly inclined toward direct involvement in the conflict, which could trigger a regional war with unpredictable consequences. I think Israel has the right to defend itself, and Iran and the extremist mullahs, right, have always been saying that they want to destroy Israel, wipe it from the face of the earth. And, them getting closer and closer to getting a nuclear weapon, the logical next step would be its use. So unlike 2020, though, I think the MAGA base is divided now on this issue. And I think lots of people support Israel, but others reject the forever war approach to things. And I think the risks here are enormous. There's going to be implications, spikes in oil prices, particularly as we move into the summer months. I think closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which will affect trade. I think domestic pressure to focus on priorities here at home are other issues that we're looking at. And then if you look sort of big picture here, what is going to happen with the objectives of involvement, right? Is this a military objective? Is the focus to destroy the nuclear infrastructure of Iran, or is it regime change? And we're seeing sort of mixed messages here. We're seeing, this interest, this conversation on the bunker buster bombs that the United States has that can go deep in underground and hit a target. Most of these labs are underground. Will the U.S. be supplying them with these bombs, or will the United States also be in line with doing regime change? We've seen the numbers of leadership of the Iranians being targeted, and Israel has been quite successful in doing away with these leaders. Is this going to continue? And then what's left? So we don't have a clear sense of what the U.S. involvement will be. We don't have a clear sense of who will fill in this void of leadership in the Middle East. Is it Saudi Arabia? Will the Russians support Iran? They've been supported. Iran has supported the Russians in their war in Ukraine. Like, there's so many questions that haven't been answered, and there's a lot of improvisation and very unclear strategy. So these are just some of the things that I think we need to take into consideration.
And I think it really matters that there's a lack of trust in the U.S. government. There's a lack of trust. You can respect and defend Israel's right to defend itself, but you can also acknowledge that the actions of the Netanyahu government have created tremendous polarization and have emboldened opposition to Israel all around the world in the way that they've happened. And similarly, I think the idea, when you look at 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, or even previous conflicts, when the United States went into Europe during World War II, we were seen as liberators. That idea was taken to the Middle East in the early 2000s, and it proved not to be true. Yeah. The U.S. was not always greeted as liberators. There was tremendous strife, uprisings, extended conflicts in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan, where the Trump administration negotiated our withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think that's an important part to remember here, is that Joe Biden got a lot of criticism for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but he was following through on a plan of withdrawal that was negotiated by the first Trump administration. And similarly in Iran here, the Obama administration had negotiated a deal with Iran to be able to manage the situation so that they used their nuclear reactors for power, not for nuclear weapons. Yeah. And the Trump administration pulled out of that, arguably creating any concern that now exists about the Iranians wanting to use their nuclear assets for refining to the point of using them for a weapon. That really matters, and it's important because the United States has lost credibility along the way. And I don't know that the Trump administration has a lot of credibility. I don't know that Iranians, and I've been seeing on social media, not just political coverage, but also there's a lot of Iranian Americans who may not like what the Iranian regime's treatment of its own people has been over the last few decades. But they also still have family there. They're not happy to see civilians being hit or hospitals being targeted. And that's serious. And we have to understand how that's shaping the reception and the visibility and the opinion of the United States all around the world. I don't know that Donald Trump has a lot of credibility, and we're certainly not going to be seen as liberators in the context of, ICE doing the things that it's doing with, masked federal agents disappearing people. It doesn't look a lot different than the regimes we're supposedly trying to oppose around the world, which I think is also part of the problem. And look, you had just in the last week, federal agents took into custody a man who had worked as an interpreter for the U.S. Army in Afghanistan. So we went into Afghanistan after 9/11, justifiably so, because they did harbor the Al-Qaeda organization that attacked us on 9/11. So entirely justified, I think, in that action. But we also asked Afghans to help us and to be part of this liberation. And many of them did, and many of them helped us as interpreters and in other ways during 20 years that the U.S. military was in Afghanistan. And when the Trump administration negotiated a withdrawal, the least we could do at that moment was to start helping those people who helped us get out of harm's way, because of course they would become immediate targets. And instead, you see the Trump administration treating Afghans and who helped us in absolutely despicable way, in the same way that they're treating all immigration enforcement, without regard for what their safety might be once they're removed. You see it with Venezuelans, with Cubans being sent back to Cuba, with Afghans being sent back to Afghanistan. And so I don't think we can disconnect the idea of what a potential attack that is actually carried out by the United States, not just with U.S. bombs, but with U.S. Assets and personnel, how it's going to be looked at differently right now because of everything else that the Trump administration is doing. And it doesn't put us in a great situation.
No, but
I don't know if we'll be safer or not.
Yeah, but I think you ask a really good question, Luis, and I would sort of ask you back a question as well, which is, a lot of these folks in different states voted for Donald Trump. A lot of the Arab American community voted for Donald Trump, and that was in reaction to what was happening in Gaza, and they didn't like what President Biden was doing in Gaza, right? Or supporting Israel in Gaza. For our, listeners, viewers, we went together to Israel. I don't know if it's 2011. You tell me if it was. I think it was 2011. As members of an AJC.
It was 2013.
2013. As members of an AJC, I think young leaders program, and we went to Israel together. It's really different when you go to Israel and you start to understand the issues. It's not just a book subject anymore, or a security issue. You really get to see how people live. You see also the size. It's tiny. Now you have Donald Trump supporting Israel's war in Iran. In addition to what he's doing, he's turning a blind eye to what's happening in Gaza. What's going to be the implication here on the domestic level? I think that the same folks that were against what was happening, the support that President Biden was giving Israel in Gaza, I do think that they're now up for grabs in a political sense. And I'm curious to see what you're seeing within the Democratic Party on how its support for Israel's intervention in Iran is. Are they supportive of this? Do you see a mixed kind of reaction? I think that, as you correctly state, Luis, all of these things have domestic implications. I think in using foreign policy terminology, these are the domestic sources of foreign policy, right? And I think that this has implications. But how are you seeing the Democratic Party? Is it aligned in its support for Israel's attack or military operations in Iran, or do you see cracks? How do you see this?
There's no alignment whatsoever. There's a significant split, but I also think that what we've seen as a result of the humanitarian crisis unleashed on Gaza, which I think anybody who just has half a heart would have to be concerned with the lack of aid, the lack of food, the starvation, the violence that has taken hold. And again, you can both recognize and acknowledge that Hamas conducted a terrorist attack, and that they murdered and that they abused and violated the safety and sanctity of the Israeli people on October 7th. But you can also be concerned about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. You have to have the humanity in that. But the conflict itself has led to a point where there is a normalization of rhetoric that would have been previously unthinkable. Look at the New York mayoral race, where Andrew Cuomo is still leading, but the candidate among a pretty crowded field that is gaining the most ground is Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani, who during a podcast interview was asked about the phrase globalize the intifada, if it made him uncomfortable, and he declined to comment, to condemn it, excuse me. He believes that he's in a safer space politically. I don't know what he believes in terms of the actual global intifada.
Yeah.
But what his answer really reveals is that he believes that it'll be politically advantageous for him to not condemn it, to not condemn it. And globalize the intifada is understandably a phrase that is seen by the Jewish community around the country and around the world, and by many non-Jews, as a call to violence, not just against the Jewish people, which it is, but also against the West more broadly and against America.
There's a
Hamas
problem.
doesn't just say, Hamas isn't just trying to, end Israel. Hamas also doesn't like the West. And, you can go back to their founding documents to see what they intended with some of their language. And the fact that he feels that he can not condemn it shows you how much the conflict in Gaza has shifted domestic politics in the United States. I think to a troubling point. But we have to reconcile with these issues. We have to reconcile with not just the extremism from whether it's Hamas or Iran, but also with the humanity of what do these responses look like, and what does it say about us as a country. This war in Iran that is unfolding is I think going to only exacerbate those divisions that are evident in the New York City mayoral race.
Yeah, and I think that it's clear that the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, has to deal with its extremes. On the Republican side, I think there's a fear in going after, condemning some of the January 6th protesters protesting the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers from different members. The same way that on the Democratic Party, there is this reluctance, as you well stated, regarding talking about someone who's calling out for an intifada. That is a signal of the polarization that exists on both sides. And the questions that I think we try to figure out is, how can we return? And I think the conversation that we had with the senator from Minnesota, how do we return to a sense of moral stability and reasonableness and humanity when we have these discussions? We've gone and we've allowed for the extremes to become relevant in, I would say, a mainstream discussion. And they have not been isolated. They've gained strength. It just seems like these extremes are gaining a lot more favor now than they have before. And that we have to wonder and ask, why is that happening? And what is the dissatisfaction within our own system and around the international system that is making these extremes more popular?
And Carl, I think, to channel college students who participated in protests, I think it's important to acknowledge that the word intifada is an Arabic word for rebellion or uprising or a resistance movement. And so they will argue passionately that intifada itself is not a dirty word. It's a resistance in the way that you're seeing resistance to ICE raids all around the country.
Yeah.
It is a resistance movement in the face of systemic or even violent oppression. And in that context, they don't want to acknowledge the violent or destructive undertones that it carries, because they're seeing it as a resistance to a violent oppression that again, even while acknowledging horrific terrorist attack on Israel and that it has a right to defend itself, that the Gaza conflict has exacerbated this sense that the Palestinians have a resistance movement that is justified. And I think that's why Mamdani saying this in the New York mayoral race is something that he sees as politically advantageous, or at least the path of least resistance. What we have to get across is talking to people in the terms that they're going to connect to more closely, right? So on the Democratic side, you see an incredible deference to how different constituency groups see or interpret any number of things. So we saw it, for example, with the names of sports teams that had names that were offensive to Native Americans. If the person who is being victimized interprets the action or the words as threatening, that's enough. That is the line that has been crossed. You see it also in the sense of just systemic oppression, where the use of the Confederate flag, the maintaining of Confederate monuments or naming of military bases under Confederate names, which we talked about last week, is offensive to people. It's interesting to me that the left that understands all of that is also willing to dismiss the idea that global intifada, even though it means annihilation for Jews, and that's how the Jewish community is interpreting it, they're interpreting it as a threat, and rightly so, they don't acknowledge that. And so what does it say about, one, growing anti-Semitism, that if there's an expression of violence towards Jews, somehow it's excusable? That's absolutely horrific. But also just that dissonance, that we're going to be sensitive to people being offended in every other community, but not if it's Jewish people who are being offended. And look, in a lot of cases, that means that it's Jewish people who have nothing to do with the Netanyahu government, who are the victims.
And then you had the issue that you stated with the base renamings all across the country, with Fort Bragg and Secretary Hegseth, I think, going in the Congress this week in different hearings justifying this, and having a pretty strong opposition from the Democratic side, as well as Senator King from Maine, right, questioning this renaming of bases named after Confederate traitors to the Republic. But each party has its own equivalent. And again, these issues need to be, I think they're unresolved, Luis, but they're creating serious polarization and problems. I think as a country, more and more you're getting the question, and I'm sure you're getting it from friends abroad, what the hell is going on in the United States, and how we've lost this sort of standard of who we were as a country, our democracy, and the things we stood for. And it's the same problems and conflicts that we're facing over and over and over again.
And let me give Mamdani some Mamdani, excuse me. Yeah. I don't want to mispronounce his name. I know he made an issue of that during the debate regarding Andrew Cuomo's mispronunciation. But let me give the Mamdani campaign or the candidate some unsolicited advice here. If you don't want to get into the specific phrasing of global intifada, the least you can say is that, look, no language that evokes violence towards any people at any moment is acceptable. Can he say that? And if he can't, frankly, I think that's disqualifying. But you should be able to, at a minimum, make a strong statement that, look, I don't want to see language that suggests or promotes or makes anyone feel that there is a call to violence anywhere. That's the least we could do for New Yorkers.
Yeah, you would hope that would be disqualifying, Luis.
That
You
is
would
the
hope.
least that we should be
Yeah.
able to say to New Yorkers and to the rest of the American people is that, you know, we should denounce any and all language that suggests violence.
Yeah, I'm
On
sure there's
either
a lot of people who wouldn't agree with that, unfortunately. But I agree with you that should be the baseline. But I think the times that we're in are proving us otherwise, and we really need to dig in as to what is making people react the way they are. And you saw this at college campuses when Jewish students weren't allowed to go to class, and this sort of acceptance from certain groups.
or barricaded inside a library
Yeah,
while doors are being pounded on.
that's
That's
right.
not acceptable.
Right. And this is the kind of behavior that I think is tolerated when you have a member that feels reluctant to condemn the use of a global intifada. That's where we are, unfortunately, in our politics, and we're trying to find our way back. I don't know if we'll find our way back so soon before we actually have confronted some of these issues. But it's unfortunate. It's a sign of the times.
All right, so we're joined now by violinist Charlie Siem, whose latest album, Brahms and Enescu, brings him back to the world stage. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Charlie, this album features music that hasn't been really recorded before. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Brahms Violin Concerto is obviously one of the most recorded pieces. It's an iconic work for the violin, a real sort of mountain to climb. But the cadenza, which is at the end of the first movement, where typically the violinist in the past would invent their own sort of reflections, kind of improvisation, basically, on the themes of the first movement. Many great violinists wrote cadenzas for the Brahms Concerto that are played again and again by most violinists. But the one I do is by George Enescu, the Romanian violinist. And that's not been previously recorded. And the short pieces, certainly two of the short pieces that I play, the aria and the scherzino, also not been recorded before. So it's a tribute to George Enescu and his kind of incredible contribution to the violin, and this relatively unknown cadenza to the Brahms Concerto that deserves its moment in the sun.
Now, you're performing on your violin. Tell us about how special it is.
It's a very special violin. I mean, it's almost 300 years old, built in Cremona in Italy in 1735 by Giuseppe Guarnerius del Gesù, who is, along with Stradivari, probably the two greatest makers of violins of all time so far. Anyway, until AI makes a violin, probably that sort of surpasses it. But it's no human beings have managed to yet. They're the sort of template for violin, the construction of a violin. And so, yeah, I mean, it's had a wonderful history being passed through great, illustrious hands of, great sort of royalty in the 19th century and great violinists in the 20th century. So it's an honor and a great privilege to be able to play it.
That is amazing.
Record on it, yeah.
and you recorded with the English Chamber Orchestra, but you tried to use minimal edits. You guys took it live to preserve the spontaneity and the emotional clarity of the music. Talk to us about why that was important to you.
Yeah, the orchestra for the Brahms Concerto is the Philharmonia, which is one of London's great orchestras. The English Chamber Orchestras, we did Canopy years ago. But this was the Philharmonia, and Oleg Kaitani conducting is a great friend of mine, and we worked on the Beethoven recording with the same team a few years ago. And I mean, the process of recording an album like this is one wants to have that, as you say, the spontaneity, the kind of live electricity of performance, but with being able to kind of iron out any kind of moments that might not be sort of as polished as you'd like for the final release. So yeah, we try to do long takes and then just kind of fix moments that need to be, but keeping the line of the music as far as possible.
Now, Charlie, Canopy is one of my favorite songs. You know this, and it's actually my ringtone. Tell us, I know the whole story about this, but tell us what inspired you to write Canopy and the different melodies.
Well, the main inspiration was you, Jeremy. Sorry, because I'm not a composer necessarily, and it was, you know, our friendship, and like we'd done a bunch of things together, and you kind of really sort of coaxed it out of me this because you persuaded me that it was a challenge that I should take on, and so that really was the sort of the initial inspiration, and then yeah, it sort of stemmed from some kind of quite simple harmonic patterns that I was used to playing on the piano, and then building these kind of climaxes. I had a kind of narrative there that was based on these tree climbers in North London that sort of had the canopy was the top of the tree. They had a whole language for climbing trees illegally. You're not allowed to climb the trees on Hampstead Heath in London, but they had a whole system of covering themselves with masks, and each stage of the sort of ascent has a name, the top of which is the canopy, when you get to sort of observe all of London from this incredible vantage point. But the sort of with the sort of bittersweet tension of the most perilous aspect of climbing trees, which is the descent once you've got to the top, because that's the most sort of dangerous and risky part of climbing trees. So I kind of had this in my imagination to a certain extent, but then music really sort of writes itself. I mean, I'm not such a programmatic person when it comes to music. I feel it's an abstract form that doesn't need any story. I mean, I think we have a kind of an abstract imagination that gets triggered by music that doesn't necessarily need to be literal in any way. But yeah, I had that in my imagination when I was kind of conceiving of some of these little climaxes that I built in the music. And yeah, and I was inspired by your enthusiasm, Jeremy. So,
Well, and
thank
I'm
you.
inspired by your music. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. In fact, the New York Times did a big feature on it, and it got rave reviews everywhere. Are you going to write more? Like, what's the future?
I mean, it's a good question. I'm not by nature somebody who would kind of, you know, goes to the studio and writes every day. Naturally, I'm obviously a violinist and an interpreter first and foremost, and that's my sort of daily study, as it were. But then I guess, yeah, if the right opportunity presents itself, if there's the right occasion or the right, I don't know, team involved to sort of inspire me to write something else, then it could happen again.
Yeah,
Well, we're excited to be able to talk about classical music here too, because it's an art form that has kind of lost ground, obviously, in recent decades. And popular music is where most ears tune in. But that's one of the things that excites me about what you've done, is that you've done some virtuosic variations of popular themes, and to break that down for the audience to really connect. Anyone who's watched Bridgerton knows what that popular theme through a classical interpretation, how powerful that can be. And so talk to us a little bit about that. And I think you've collaborated with Bryan Adams, with Lady Gaga, with The Who. That I think is one of the coolest things that I've ever seen.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the concept of classical music really only emerged when pop culture became so sort of prevalent, I guess, in the kind of 50s onwards, because really there was to sort of define hundreds of years of music all in one generalized box of classical music isn't really fair. I mean, you've got, whether it's Baroque or kind of, again, even these terms are kind of, I don't necessarily think serve the music well, but you've got 18th century, the changing times, and the music reflects that, the 19th century, the 20th century, all of the different kinds of music that sort of that came out of these different periods in history. It can't necessarily be all lumped into one sort of genre of classical music, but certainly the idea of picking up what was popular at the time, the melody that was popular at the time, and creating a kind of fantasy or a virtuosic variation on it is what many great violinists did in the 19th century. Paganini famously, but then Wieniawski, Vieuxtemps, these are all the great. They used themes that were well known, whether it was the Carmen, the famous themes from Carmen to make a fantasy, or whether it was an aria from an opera that everybody recognized. And these violinists would then make virtuosic variations on that. And so in that vein, it started when I was asked by Bryan Adams to do a duet with him at the Albert Hall years ago now, like 2009. I thought, well, this is again, in a very small way, this is an interesting way of just taking a popular melody from today, since the emergence of pop culture, which, maybe didn't sort of exist quite in the same way in the 19th century. And then putting that virtuosic, violinistic sort of flourish on it. And that was fun, definitely. I like that, and I would love to do more of that.
Nice.
Charlie, you've done some brand collaborations too with Dior and some main fashion labels, and in that you've gotten quite a audience of young listeners. You're bringing young people into a genre that they might not have experienced before.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it was sort of I was presented with these opportunities as my career started to develop initially, and it seemed a wonderful way of kind of getting a sort of having a wider reach, getting a sort of younger audience to maybe engage with this music that I love to play, classical music, and so yeah, I mean, it's quite organic. Initially, it was not necessarily a very sort of well thought through strategy, but I think one thing led to another, and that really sort of helped to kind of establish me at that stage in my career, and so it became sort of part of my identity at that time to a certain extent.
Well, we're very happy to have Canopy on our show.
Yeah. We'll weave it in. We'll use it at the intro as part of the opening sequence, and use some of those high moments to
Nice.
Bring attention to important story changes. So I really, really appreciate it. We're excited to be able to use it.
No, definitely. I mean, it was Jeremy's initiative that it happened. So with pleasure that you can use it. Yeah.
Well,
That's
just
amazing.
to add context, Charlie and I are friends, and I was at CBS Television. We had a magazine, and I thought this would be a really great. I wanted Charlie to write a song, a theme song for the magazine, because everything was going digital. And Charlie came up with this amazing piece that we used so much, and it really became the ears of our music, of our magazine, so to speak. And the song will live on hundreds of years. When we're all gone, Canopy will be here for other generations to listen to.
No, thank you for saying so. Yeah. No, it was a real pleasure being able to have the challenge of writing it, and it was a fun and rewarding process together with you, Jeremy, and your team. You remember all the events and different things we did around it, in the UK and in America and in New York and Los Angeles and everything. So it was a fun chapter.
It was,
when I hear it, it reminds me of that, and so that puts a smile on my face.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Charlie. We appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you for having me on the show and for using Canopy, and yeah, look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you back when you're in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right,
in
Charlie.
fact, I'm playing in New York, 16th of November in Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
Carnegie Hall, November 16th. Charlie CM.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you, Charlie. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for talking to me.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, Carl, thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to our guests, Melissa Lopez-Franson and Charlie CM. And thank you all for listening and subscribing. This is an important space to elevate these ideas at the center of our political spectrum, to be able to discuss both sides and do it in a way that reduces the rhetoric, so that it's less heated. And so your subscription and your support means so much. Our panel featured Luis Miranda, former Obama White House communications advisor and former spokesperson at DHS, Carl Meacham, former Clinton appointee and a former senior Republican staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Jeremy Murphy, former CBS executive, author, and publicist.